So welcome and happy Friday to everyone. We're so happy you're here joining us this afternoon on this crisp fall Friday from Baltimore, Maryland. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums, the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Libraries, I encourage you to ask your questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We will definitely have time to answer your questions at the end of the program. So now I have the pleasure of turning the program over to my friend, Jim Williams. Jim?
Thank you, Jamie. I don't see my image on the screen, but I assume that it's being projected.
I see you, Jim.
Okay. Well, hello and welcome to today's talk in our Lunch with the Library Speakers Series. As mentioned, I'm Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Libraries, a group that has supported Johns Hopkins Libraries for over 85 years. If you're an alum, you may be familiar with our libraries on the Homewood campus, the Milton Eisenhower Library, the Brody Learning Commons, and the Hutzler Reading Room in Gilman Hall. However, there are two more members of the Sheridan Libraries, the John Wirt Garrett Library at the Evergreen Museum, and the subject of today's presentation, the George Peabody Library in downtown Baltimore. The Peabody Library is a gem of 19th century architecture, commonly referred to as a Cathedral of Books. It is consistently ranked as one of the most beautiful libraries in the world, and is also ranked among the 5 most impressive university libraries in the United States. While the Peabody soaring stacks are a coveted backdrop for special events and wedding photos, the library's primary function is to serve as a research-oriented, non-circulating collection of over 300,000 rare and unique volumes that date back as far as the 15th century. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to take a minute to thank my fellow Friends of the Libraries who are joining us today. They make programs like this one possible while providing academic resources for students, faculty, and the Baltimore community at large. If you would like to join our Friends group, I encourage you to do so by the end of the year. Anyone can become a member of the Friends by making a financial gift at www.libraries.jhu/give. In this challenging year, your gift will have a significant impact more than ever. A beautiful and historic place like the Peabody Library doesn't come alive without phenomenal people running it. In this regard, we are very lucky to have Paul Espinosa as the curator of the Peabody Library. Paul holds master's degrees in classics and library science from the University of Maryland. As curator of the Peabody, Paul helps researchers access and use the special collections. He conducts classes using primary sources, leads various tours, and helps organize the Peabody's extraordinary special exhibitions. Paul's warmth and passion for his work come through every time one interacts with him. I'm sure you'll see the same today. Paul, thank you for taking us on a virtual tour of the George Peabody Library.
Thank you very much, Jim, and the Friends group. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So thanks again to Jim and the Friends group, and to Jamie and the Alumni Association, and to my colleagues that have been helping me, Stacy and Heather and others. And thanks to everybody who is joining us virtually today. I really wish we could be together in person. And though I'm not sure how many folks are out there watching, you can consider this my offer to give you an in-person tour of the library when we return to a new normal, as they say, and you can make it to Baltimore. So hopefully this will whet your appetite to learn more about the library and the collection and the architecture. And so I'm more than happy to show you around the actual physical building when we have a chance. Okay, so I want to start with this slide. As Jim mentioned, I pursued a degree in classics, and I love this book, which is in our collection. This is one of the prizes of our collection. It's a mouthful for a title, Hypnerotomachia Polyphily. You have to read it backwards. The strife of love, eros, the strife of love in hypnos, in a dream. So the strife of love in a dream of Polyphilus, the young fellow you see dozing in the grove here. This was considered one of the most important and beautiful books ever printed. This was printed in Venice by a gentleman named Aldus Manutius in 1499. It's what they call a macaronic text. It has both Latin and Italian and sort of a made-up language as well. But this is really considered the ultimate Renaissance book because young Polyphilus there falls asleep in this grove. And when he wakes up, like every Renaissance scholar wishes he could, he wakes up in among the ruins of antiquity, as you see on the second page there. And he goes exploring, almost gets destroyed by maenads, as you would, but falls in love and eventually wins the day. But this idea of falling asleep and then waking up among those wonderful sought after ruins really hits home to me, because here is a young Paul falling asleep with a book in his hand, and to awake in my own set of ruins, if you will, these wonderful, antique, beautiful Renaissance printed volumes that fill our rare book room here at the library. You can imagine this is my dream job. And so I'm in the enviable position of looking over the wonderful George Peabody Library. And I must certainly say it has been quite difficult to be away from the collection, to be away from students and colleagues. And so I thank you for this opportunity to do what I find most rewarding, and that is to share this collection. Okay, so as Jim mentioned, we are just one of quite a few locations throughout the Sheridan Libraries and Museums. That includes the John Wart Garrett Library, the Eisenhower, and these others. I'll take you through those here in a second quickly, but I just wanted to show you another wonderful discovery. Just like I can put my picture in that Renaissance text, a peer did that in the late 1490s or so. If you can see this small little doodle in the margin of this text, this Latin text printed in 1496. This was a wonderful discovery, this doodle, this marginalia, made by actually a Hopkins PhD student in history named Neil Weir. And Neil graduated, I think it was 2 years ago now, with a PhD in history, and is now actually pursuing rare books as a special collections curator at the University of Florida. So we steered him into rare books, as they say. But he found this doodle one day while looking through the books, and I love the little book that you see this fellow's holding. You can see the hardware, as they say on that book, matches a 15th and 16th century hardware on a book, as you can see in this chained binding over here. But anyway, the quotation next to this little doodle, why draw a little man holding a book? Well, because that wonderful quotation reads, "One ought to read books, for it is profitable to continually turn over the pages of authors, and it is useful to know many things." That's quite a nice, that's not too bad for a motto, a certain bookish philosophy, if you will. And it's a philosophy that really informs my job, to turn students, to turn you today perhaps, into that figure in the margin with book in hand and eager even to read and learn many things. So let's take a look at some of our locations. So here we have the Evergreen Museum and Library, and this is on the Evergreen campus, if you will. This beautiful library was designed by Lawrence Hall Fowler, an important Baltimore architect. And this has some of the real gems of our collection. This has the famous Audubon bird folios, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The first 4 folios of Shakespeare, lots of incunables, early books printed in the first 50 years of printing, and manuscripts, wonderful architecture book collection as well. We use all these collections in our teaching. Most of you are probably familiar with the Eisenhower Library. That's probably where you spent much of your time as an undergraduate or graduate student at Hopkins. The Eisenhower Library was built in 1964, named after a former president of the Hopkins University, Milton Eisenhower, the brother of the famous president. And this is a common scene in the Eisenhower Library. And a scene I'm sure so many of our students are yearning for, given our current situation. I do love this photo because if you can see there in the background, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there in the background is a wonderful fine art photograph of the Peabody Library. This was done by a famous German photographer named Candida Hoffer. This was done in 2010. She came into the library and set up quite a contraption to capture this full view. This, along with photos of the Walters Art Gallery, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and other local landmarks, was on display at the National Gallery in DC. And then this wonderful print, which is quite large, it's 6 feet wide by 7 feet high, was gifted to the Sheridan Libraries by Robert Meyerhoff and Rita Becker. And we put it on display for a few months every year there in the Eisenhower Library to coax the students to come down and check out the Peabody Library. I often tease them and tell them the Eisenhower is a very social situation and you can get much more done here at the beautiful Peabody Library. But again, this social situation is what we all long for today. So this is a common scene, or perhaps this is how you remember the Eisenhower. See, I'm not the only one to fall asleep at my books. This is quite a common scene during midterms and finals weeks as well. Also, you may remember if you haven't been to campus in a while, the wonderful Brody Learning Commons, which was constructed in 2012. This sits adjacent to the Eisenhower Library. You can see the original brick of the Eisenhower Library next to it. When they asked the students what they wanted in this new study space, the answer was unanimous: more sunlight, give us light. And you can see the architects did a great job there of bringing in lots of natural light. Well, within the Brody Learning Commons, we have a wonderful rare books reading room and the university archives. These are some students that my colleague Heidi Herr, who you may have heard from in one of these previous series, host every year a freshman open house to bring students in and to page through these old books and to get them excited about rare books and manuscripts. And then you will also remember the Hutzler Reading Room. This was named after one of the original, well, not the original, but one of the past trustees. It was dedicated in his name in 1965. And in I forget the year now, they underwent a major restoration. And when they did that, they took out these beautiful stained glass windows And you may not have realized it at the time, but those stained glass windows were decorated with these wonderful printer's devices, or printer's emblems, if you will. And so this is the printer's device for Aldus Manutius, the printer of that Hypnorrhadomachia polyphily that we saw at the beginning. He was a Venetian printer. And so what they did was that when they designed these stained glass windows, they used these printing devices. And this is a great idea, if you think about it, right? Because the Hutzler Reading Room was originally designed to be a library to house many of the individual department libraries at Hopkins, classics, history, languages, that sort of thing. And the early Hopkins students and scholars would have been handling these old rare books quite commonly. And it's a way to inspire, really, the reader and the researcher, if you think about it. What I think is so interesting, to move on to the Peabody Library now finally, is that this idea was captured by one of the first librarians the year after the Peabody Library opened. Excuse me. So, the first librarian, a gentleman named Nathaniel Morrison of the Peabody Library, wrote, "The setting and surroundings of books are as suitable for ornamentation, are as legitimate objects on which to display artistic beauty and taste, as are title pages, paper, print, margins, and bindings." So that's a mouthful, but what he's saying there is the surroundings need ornamentation just as much as title pages and the like. And this is a beautiful title page here by William Morris, the famous Kelmscott Press. And I love these beautiful wood block produced tendrils that you see around the margins. And you can see, right, the railings here of the Peabody Library are picking up on these design elements, and they're influencing each other. Now, the thing is, once I read this quote, you start to see this everywhere, as they say. So here's a title page of a book from the 1600s. You can see that architectural element there in the pillars, right? And there are our pillars here in the library. Again, you start to see this everywhere. This is a wonderful Morocco binding, and those palmettes in the binding there, the gold, mirror the palmettes in the railings as well. Even as something as innocuous as this wonderful, if you can see my cursor there, this is a bookend, a book stop that was patented April 30th, 1878 for the Peabody Library. And you can see the little tendrils there and the little rosette there, right? Sadly, I haven't found too many of these bookends because they replaced them at some point with more modern ones, back in the 30s or 40s. But I wish they would have kept all these original ones with those original stenciled 1878 dates on them. Okay. Again, you see these things everywhere. This is one of the original door fixtures. And I see that rosette there on the door. You see these in these Alba Amicorum, these little friendship albums. These are manuscripts from Germany from the 1640s and 50s. Again, you see these everywhere. Now, Morrison continued. Oh, and they would make these beautiful inlaid gold bindings by using tools like this that you see here. Morrison continues, a grand hall filled with the gathered wisdom of the ages. Let me see if I can move this. Visibly set in alcoves chastely but richly ornamented, will impress the young student with a respect for books and a sense of their importance. Now, I like this quote as well. This idea of impressing the young student. This is what we try to do. Now, take a step back though, it's important to remember that the Peabody Library hasn't always been part of Johns Hopkins. It was its own library, part of its own institution for the longest time. And then at one point, it became part of the Enoch Pratt library system here in Baltimore. And then it fell on hard times, and a group here in Baltimore, Baltimore City, a group of philanthropists and Johns Hopkins University incorporated the library and the music school all around us in 1978. But these are two nice quotes, I think, that show how things really sort of came full circle. Peabody wanted to have the best in literature and every department of knowledge to satisfy the researchers of students. And Daniel Gilman in 1876 didn't want to expend too much money on a huge library because he knew that the Peabody Library was well suited for the beginning Hopkins campus or student body. And so that's what we try to do today. We try to bring this material to students. Just like we saw those students on M level, we know that a beginning student can go their whole career on a laptop. We want to keep that from happening. We want to put these books in front of them, help them make discoveries, and write original research and and really understand where this long liberal arts tradition, scientific tradition has come from that they're taking part in. So how did we get here? Well, here is George. And in his founder's letter of 1857, he writes, "I have determined without further delay to establish and endow an institute which will be useful towards the improvement of the moral and intellectual culture of the inhabitants of Baltimore and towards the enlargement and diffusion of a taste for the fine arts." Okay. And I love this, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. We didn't own this, believe it or not. This is written in 1869, part of his obituary. But I found this on eBay one day, and for $20, we had to have it. Peabody was an important philanthropist, of course, but an important businessman. He made his start here in Baltimore, primarily in overseas trade. And by 1837, he moves to London to look over that end of his business. And while in London, that's really how he makes his fortune. There in London, he guarantees the loans that English bankers are making to American entrepreneurs to build the railroads and to go west and to establish an infrastructure and that sort of thing. These English bankers don't quite trust the Americans to pay them back. Peabody says, "I'll stand them in good stead." And so when they do pay off those loans, he does quite well on the commission. This is a wonderful businessman's letter writing book. Helps you sort of form letters in there, how to collect on loans and how to extend credit and these sorts of things. And Peabody was so well known, he got both a two-toned cover and a full color cover. Here is the opening of the Institute in 1866, if you can see that. There's George right there in the middle, if you can see my cursor. Thousands of school children came out to see this. Okay. In that founding letter, Peabody specified he wanted a public art gallery, a public lecture series, a music conservatory, and a free public, though non-circulating library. Okay. Here are some tickets from the public lecture series. Quite a few notable scholars came through as part of that. Ralph Waldo Emerson gave 4 lectures here. Whitman was in the audience to hear those lectures. It's neat to think about these American greats walking these halls. Here's a picture of the art gallery, the statue gallery. These were marble and plaster copies that art students could come and draw from and sculpt from. Otherwise, you had to travel to Europe on the grand tour to ever see these things. And then, of course, the music school, which has really put us on the map today. They have a wonderful group of students. These are some of the most talented students in the country, as you can imagine. It's quite competitive to attend. And it's a wonderful place to work because you can walk the halls and hear these wonderful concert rehearsals and recitals and you name it. They have a wonderful preparatory department. You can see the dance students up there as well. Renowned faculty, this is Leon Fleischer, the famous pianist who unfortunately passed away this past year. There he is receiving his Kennedy Center Award honor as well. Okay, now let's get into the library, finally. So when I turn that doorknob, when I'm normally giving a tour or hosting a class, people are one of the funnest aspects is to watch people's mouths drop and their eyes grow wide as they walk in. I say this is one of a rather modest library sign. This was the original sign that hung outside this grand entrance to the library. And there you go. This is what you see when you walk in. Quite remarkable, as you can imagine. Okay. This is a photograph taken in 1899, which shows not too much has changed, really. The collection has grown in leaps and bounds from this photograph in 1899. You can see at the back wall there, you can see my cursor. These haven't even filled in with books today. We're full of books, of course. And take a look at this display case down here on the floor. You'll notice that display case is still here in this picture. And before anybody asks, let me see if I can anticipate this. This is not a current photo. This is a photo or a still from the movie Sleepless in Seattle, 1993. People often ask, have movies been filmed here? I didn't realize this until a couple days ago, but also a movie called Washington Square, 1997, starring Jennifer Jason Leigh, based on a Henry James novel as well. And apparently the library served as a Parisian bookstore, 19th century Parisian bookstore. I wish I had been here. That would have been pretty neat to see these costumed actors. This would have much of what the original patrons of the library would have perhaps looked like. So I want to share, since you can't be here to take in the library and all its magnificence, I want to show you some beautiful photographs that were taken in 2013. This one, quite a stunning image, as you can see. This is from upstairs on the 3rd floor. People often wonder why we don't let them upstairs. If you can tell by the scale here, the railings there really are not that tall. They're not up to code, as they say, and so we don't want people to fall. Beautiful architectural elements here. And then probably my favorite image, this image looking down. When the photographer showed me this, I said, how in the world did you do that? Well, this is how he did it. These were all photographs taken by a young student at the time, Matthew Petrov, who completed his Bachelor of Science degree in computer science and physics. Today, he's working towards his PhD in physics at Hopkins using this class telescope, cosmology, large angular scale surveyor in the desert regions of Chile. Matt is so very impressive, as you can imagine. But he set up this rig where the camera moved along remotely, and then he would snap pictures, and then he stitched all those together to create that view. And there's Matthew there on top of this telescope in the blue shirt. And this is before they transported this telescope from a Hopkins lab out to the deserts in Chile. There it is there, and there's the night sky behind it. And I'm not going to take credit and say that we taught this student to look up, but we certainly, his dream of mapping the stars was there before, but we certainly gave him a place to experiment, if you will. And that's what I love about working here in the library, working with students and letting the place come alive for them, even if it's not with an old book per se, but even just the space. Okay, let's talk about the architecture. This is Edmund Lind, the architect. There are his dates there. And we are on the Peabody campus of Johns Hopkins University. This is in downtown Baltimore, next to the Washington Monument, as you may know. One of Lind's most important models was this Cincinnati Public Library. He never really fully acknowledged this publicly, but this library you can see in this Harper's Weekly, it looks quite similar to the Peabody Library. This was built 1873. The Peabody Library dates from 1878, so it precedes us. And there's a picture of it in the 1940s, I believe, and you can see it was quite precarious. The open stacks were really sort of open. There was just that really small railing that wrapped around the stacks like that. Sadly, this wonderful iron structure was demolished in the 1950s in Cincinnati. I'm sure they regret it today, and I'm so glad Baltimore didn't choose to do the same thing with the Peabody. We own Lind's original architectural drawings in the archives. Here is one for the beautiful spiral staircase. I think one of the most beautiful spiral staircases I've ever seen. This sits in the music school in the Institute. I'm sure some of you have seen it. This is his sketch of the skylight. Let's take a closer look at the skylight. This is the original iron truss work that you can see up there. Again, 1878. Everything is iron. The skylight, the columns, the floors, you name it. These are the floors of the stacks. These are the marble floors down below, and people often ask about these plates. We have put in these plates back in the 80s or so, because underneath those plates are these beautiful lattice work grates, grill work. And if you lift those up, these are quite heavy. You see these wonderful steam heating pipes that ran parallel the whole length of the floor, and this is how they would heat the space. Now, these are quite decorative and quite beautiful. I wish we could expose these, but we have so many functions in the library that heels would be sure to be caught in this grill work, unfortunately. So we have them covered up for safety. Lots of events like weddings. You can imagine lots of folks dance out there on the dance floor. Just wouldn't work with this group. And sadly, right, with the pandemic, we've really taken a hit in the wedding department, which provides wonderful revenue for the library, as you can imagine. And our private events team has been doing a wonderful job of trying to rebook clients or reset their dates for the ones that had dates during the pandemic. We have some of the original catalogs of the iron company, Bartlett and Robbins, as well. Can anybody recognize this dog? What is a dog doing on an iron works catalog? Well, if you turn that just right, it turns out it's actually a Chesapeake Bay retriever. And they actually cast these in iron, and you could put them in your garden or your house. Here is the original skylight, again, signed by the Bartlett and Robbins Company. And believe it or not, we actually use that skylight in classes. In 2017, we did a major restoration of that skylight to replace the glass that's above there. It had worn thin. And a gentleman named John Matteo, who's on the faculty of the engineering group, or engineering faculty at Hopkins, worked for a company that redid this skylight. And so he brings his classes to look at the work that they did. This is what they call a saddle. This is all new work, but it just sits around the original ironwork and doesn't disturb the original fabric, as they say, and just supports it. I have some links in the bottom of the presentation that talk more about these things, about that telescope, about this skylight work as well. So you can check those out if you're interested. Okay, let's get to the books. So books, books, and more books. Morrison, the first librarian, said, though our library furnishes a very small amount of popular literature, we have a much more expensive class of books. Books much more difficult to procure: science, literature, history, travels, antiquities, and the mechanical arts. So again, as Peabody said, of the most approved literature, right? This was really meant to be a fairly high scale or high value library, if you will. They weren't collecting dime store novels, comic books, these sorts of things, of the romance novels of the day. And how did they go about collecting those books? Well, they drew up this wish list of books, and they sent this in 1863, you can see the date there, and sent this off to book dealers in the States and in Europe, and then the books started to pour in. And this is quite a thick book. There's actually two volumes to it. This one is well worn because it is chock full of these notes by the early librarians. You'll see the word B-O-T, that means bought. O-R-D means ordered. And what's so interesting is that you'll see lots of 19th century titles that they were looking for, contemporary titles. But you can see here at the bottom of this one, they've scribbled in there looking for a multi-volume set from the 1690s through the 1700s. And so what's so great is that not just contemporary books came into the collection, but rather old books as well. This is a wonderful set of travels and voyages from 1625 that made it into the collection early on. Not too accurate. It makes California an island, but that's okay. This was part of their intellectual universe, right? They wanted to understand the history of these concepts, not just the latest research. Here's a wonderful page. You can see here at the bottom, C. Darwin, Charles Darwin, bought. Now they were looking for the American edition of The Origin of the Species, 1860 New York. They ended up with one of those, but they also ended up with the first London edition, 1859. You can imagine what it means to put this in front of a first-year biology student or somebody studying genetics here at Hopkins. It makes quite an impression. It's in its original binding, has its original binder's ticket. It's got all the bells and whistles, as they say. This wonderful book, this is known as the Kelmscott Chaucer. This was again produced by William Morris. This is 1896. The drawings, the woodcuts were done by pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones. And this is considered one of the most beautiful books ever printed. Only 428 of these ever printed. Morris designed his own type, his own inks, his own paper. Really wanted to return to the arts and crafts movement, or initiated the arts and crafts movement by looking back to Renaissance book production. And it's books like this that allow us to teach just how these books were made. So the arts of printing, for example. This is a wonderful plate from the famous French Encyclopédie of 1751, which shows printers at work. typesetters at work up at the top, and these sorts and how they would line these up backwards so that they printed the right way around. I always love to show students that the technology of printing did not change for the longest time. This is a photograph from the 1920s of a printer still setting his type. There's a printer's case, again, from the encyclopedia. This is always fun trivia to show groups. So you'll notice in the top here, the letters, the capital letters, right? And then down here, the small letters, right? Well, we also call these, this is a printer's case, we call these uppercase letters and lowercase letters, right? And this vocabulary is still with us today. This is a wonderful anthropomorphized view of a printer from a French volume of the same time period. How did they illustrate these books? We also teach this as well. This is a wonderful wood block that one of my colleagues, Earl Havens, procured for us from a rare book dealer one day. This block is from the 1560s, believe it or not. And if you see it in person, it's hard to see in this image, but in relief, but just how much skill would have gone into carving this block. And believe it or not, we have the book that was printed, an herbal in which this block was printed. So there, that picture of me holding the block next to the actual page, these are now reunited. They touched in 1563, that block actually touched that piece of paper in 1563, and now they're reunited in 2020 here in the library. They actually reprinted some of these blocks. You can see in the white pages over here just how crisp and clear those blocks still print today. I imagine if we had a professional printer print that block, they could pull a similar impression. But again, this impresses upon students the care, the workmanship, the labor of love that went into printing these books. And we share this material not just with Hopkins students, but also Micah, the local art college, Goucher, and others in the area. Okay. We have this wonderful second edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Now you'll remember I said Emerson came and spoke at the Peabody Library, or at the Peabody Institute, and Whitman was there to hear him speak. So these two had met, but famously on this spine of his second edition, Whitman printed, if you can see it there at the bottom, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career, Ralph Waldo Emerson." Emerson had written this privately to Whitman in a letter. Whitman didn't ask for permission, but had it printed right there on the spine of his book. It was second edition. Emerson was a little peeved by this, to say the least. There's a bit of Whitman's poetry. I won't read it to you, but it doesn't get much better than that. I expect that last stanza there has a special relevance today, right? If you've gone out to the park just to relax amid all of this crises, right? We have a wonderful Don Quixote collection. This is our earliest, 1617 by Cervantes. My favorite though is actually a children's edition. This is a French edition, Don Quixote pour les enfants, forgive my French, 1912, but nobody captures Sancho better than this illustrator. I don't, for my money. This wonderful small pamphlet, it's only about 10 pages long, printed here in Baltimore, 1836, describing a gigantic mastodon or American mammoth at the Baltimore Museum. And a great graphic designer for this book had this wonderful idea of this fold out that you can see here that allows you to get a sense of the vastness of this mastodon and the scale with these two figures in the foreground. This is an extremely important work because this comes out of this famous painting by Charles Willson Peale, exhuming the first American mastodon, 1806. That's about 20 years before. I think this is one of the most important paintings in American art. This is actually, I should have put it there, but this is actually owned by the Maryland Historical Society, just a few doors down from us. Believe it or not, they don't own that pamphlet that we have. But this mastodon was the first prehistoric creature discovered in the New World. Jefferson took real pride in this and wrote to naturalists in Europe to say, look, we are just as old and august and ancient as the old world here in the new. And then this wonderful broadside that we acquired a couple years ago. And I wish I had a better picture of it, but this is a broadside. We have it framed now, but it reads, "The Great American Mastodon, now exhibiting in the hall, 20,000 pounds, so on and so forth." Now, I want you to look at the punctuation there behind mastodon. So I brought this out to show a group of students when it first arrived, and I didn't make the connection, but one of the students said, "Hey, look at those two exclamation points." And I said, "Yeah, that is interesting. Why two? Why not three? Why not one?" Well, look over at the fold out there. What does a mastodon have two of? Those big tusks, right? So I think this is deliberate and quite creative and quite creative for the student to notice that as well. We have books in the collection that were so lucky that they purchased when they did, because they would just be cost prohibitive today. This is a famous set by Edward Muybridge, known as Animal Locomotion. This was printed in 1885. This is the beginnings of the art of photography. These are wonderful images of animals moving, people, horses, carriages, acrobats, you name it. And this plate is especially important because if you look closely, the center one at the bottom, film strip there or photo strip, you can see that horse is actually floating. You can't see this with the naked eye. It happens too quickly. But Muybridge photographed these horses on the ranch of Leland Stanford of Stanford University fame. There was a bet that, to see if the horse is actually floating. It turns out it is. It's quite a dramatic picture to see, right, for the first time. Imagine seeing that for the first time. A lot of books came into the library because it was such an important library, a library of record. In other words, you wanted your book to end up here at the Peabody Library. This is a wonderful example of that. You can see on the spine there, it says Biblia Sacra 1501, presented to the Peabody Institute, Baltimore by A. Kimmel, Frederick County, Maryland, 1863. Well, I don't know if you can read that handwriting there. I've got it here in front of me. This is a relic of the past. Remember I said waking up among those relics? Printed at Venice in the year 1501. This is Kimmel himself inscribing the front cover there. He says, "It is a rare book. I bought it in Corso, Rome, and it is 361 years old. I brought it to the land, the home of the brave. Please accept it as an earnest of my highest esteem, in which I most fondly hold the liberal and generous, my friend, George Peabody, the Marylander in London. Most respectfully, Anthony Kimmel, 1863. Quite a patriotic sentiment for this Frederick County, Maryland local. But in 1863, the library had just been founded, and he knew that this book would find a wonderful home at the library in honor of George Peabody. sometimes we make these discoveries. This is a wonderful book that I found not too long ago, The Artwork of Louis Comfort Tiffany. The year on this one was 1914. And it's hard to see in this image, but that binding actually shines, not unlike a Tiffany shade, lampshade or something like that. It actually almost sparkles. But this was just a series of images of his work, or of the company's work. And lo and behold, when you open it up, there's written in nice calligraphy, "To the Peabody Institute with the best wishes of," and then actually signed by Louis C. Tiffany, June 1960. So in other words, Tiffany and the company knew this book was so important. There were only 350 of these printed or so, that they wanted it to come directly to the Peabody Institute Library as a library of note. We have wonderful collections. I'm going pretty long, I apologize, but let me try to wrap this up. We have wonderful collections. Here is a wonderful collection given in honor of Hopkins alumnus, Robert Wilson, a gift of Richard Frary, part of our friends group, part of our board of trustees for the libraries. Here's Mencken, a wonderful Mencken collection, drinking his first pint after Prohibition. It's fun to put material like this next to books on prohibition enforcement in the collection. We have a wonderful map collection given by a former alumnus, Willard Hackerman. And if any of you were in the School of Engineering, you'll probably know this name. Hackerman Hall was dedicated in 2010. Mr. Hackerman gave a wonderful map collection about 2 years ago now to the library, including some important and historic Baltimore maps, this one from, or Maryland maps, this one from 1671. With that came a wonderful collection of prints from the Venable law firm that were actually on display with Mr. Hackerman's maps. This is an extremely rare print celebrating the passage of the 15th Amendment and the celebration, you can see the title there, that was held at Baltimore in 1870. And again, this is quite timely. You'll see the pillars of education and science holding up there at the top, the ballot box. Quite a poignant message for us today. We have a wonderful Dorothy Scott collection of 4-edge painted books. Many of you may know these. When you bend the pages, the pages just right, you get these wonderful hand-painted images on displayed pages. This is the works of Shakespeare, and there you see Queen Elizabeth. Here's a Byron edition. Here's a Winnie the Pooh, a first edition of Winnie the Pooh with the whole gang up there, you can see. We also, we don't just teach in this collection, we do lots of programming and events. This is a wonderful program called In the Stacks, curated by a gentleman named Sam Besson, who was a Peabody student and now works for the libraries. And what Sam and his musicians that he goes out and finds do is that they find material from the collections here in the library or in the archives that they can use to put to music or to explain the theory behind the music and that sort of thing. It's been quite a wonderfully successful program. They always have a full packed house, as you can see here. And again, people aren't just coming to hear Beethoven, they're coming to hear a story and history behind the music and behind composers. We also have a wonderful ballroom experience. This was from 2019. This is in collaboration with the Baltimore ballroom community. This is a local LGBTQ group that puts on these balls, which includes what are called effects. And I love this costume. It's part costume show, part not costume, but part effects show, part fashion show, part dance, you name it. And I love this costume showing with books on this person's head here. This was done right here in the space. It also included the Peabody dance students participated in this, and they really learned a lot through that. We have yearly exhibitions in the library. This is our exhibition hall. This was the map exhibit that I mentioned. Our latest, which just ended in March, just before the pandemic hit, thankfully, was the photography of John Clark Maiden. This is a well-received exhibit in the space. John Clark Maiden, local photographer who took photographs of Baltimore from the 1960s up through the 2000s. And just some wonderful images. This one is my favorite. I love the juxtaposition there of old and young. Okay, and finally, recent scholarship in the collection. We've had some wonderful scholars, as you can imagine. This old black and white is John Dos Passos in the collection, working in the collection. This is Mary Ryan, a Hopkins professor who used many of those maps in this book, recent book. And then these are also recent works to come out of the collection. William Eggington, a professor of Spanish who wrote about Cervantes, and then Andrew Devereaux, a wonderful PhD student who finished his first book using much of our material. Okay, I've gone way too long, so I'm going to stop there and turn it over back to Jamie. Thank you.
Hi, well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I think we can all agree that was fascinating. And I just want to share with you, we may not be able to get to too many of your questions, but I will share all the questions with our speaker, and he may be able to reach out to you individually and answer some of the questions. So I'm just going to ask a few. First is, what are the oldest books you have in your collection at the Peabody Library?
Well, we have about 50 what are called incunables, books printed from the first 50 years of the printing press. We have 3 or 4 manuscripts, books of hours from the 1490s or so, as well, in the 1450s. So those are really our oldest books. Yeah.
And what do you consider the most important rare book in the Peabody Library, and why?
The most important, that just depends, really. Sometimes it changes for me. That Hypnorautomachia I showed you is probably one of our most important. We have a wonderful book called the Nuremberg Chronicle that was printed in 1493. Extremely important book. That Kelmscott Chaucer, again, only one of 428 ever printed. We have first editions of Darwin, as I mentioned, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Copernicus and Galileo. So it just really depends on what you're most interested in. Okay.
That's very, very interesting. So I have a kind of a fun question I see here. Is it true that the library in the movie Beauty and the Beast was inspired by the Peabody Library, if you know?
So that's what I've heard. It was before my time, but supposedly the animators for Beauty and the Beast came and spent a couple days sketching the space just to be inspired. And so it translated, I think, eventually into the series.
That's cool. So this is another good question. It amazes me that there are doodles in notes in rare books. How common were doodles?
It just depended really on the owner. We love to find those, obviously. Scholars tended to mark up their margins with notes and glosses and that sort of thing on a much more common basis. Yeah, doodles aren't all that common. Maybe sometimes you'll see plants doodled if they're describing a plant or islands or these sorts of things. Sometimes you'll see a crocodile if they're describing a crocodile in Latin. But one of my favorite marginalia, as we call it, is at the end of Herman Melville's Typee. We have a first edition, and you can tell it was by a young person, just based on the handwriting. And he wrote, good read, first rate. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like we are out of time. So
I apologize.
No. Please don't apologize. That was wonderful. Your slides were amazing, and I think we all definitely enjoyed it. And we want to thank you for your time and your talent. And we'd also like to thank our audience for joining us for today's webinar. A follow-up email will be shared with you that will include a recording of the program along with a list of resources and our event schedule. We hope you will join us at a future webinar. So thanks again, our audience. Have a happy, healthy, safe Thanksgiving. And thank you, Paul. You were wonderful.
I put my email at the bottom of the address, or feel free to email me with those questions.
I can share that in the in my follow-up email. So thank you so much again. Bye.